Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here, critiquing subscriber mixes, episode 5. So before we begin, I just want to say this. There are so many things that home studio owners tend to gloss over when it comes to carving out and creating a pro level production. And I don't want this for you. I want you to achieve truly professional results within your home studio with the gear you already have, because it's more than possible. So be sure to download my polished production checklist where I point out some of these areas where people tend to gloss over that you absolutely should not be glossing over. Again, you can download the guide for absolutely free and it'll point you in the right direction if you're looking to achieve truly professional results. Now, before I start critiquing these mixes, I just want to remind you that we got to remember, mixing is an art form and is extremely subjective. All of this is just my opinion, and anything that I hear that I feel will really help push the mixes in the right direction with minimal tweakage and minimal fuss. So with that out of the way, let's start listening to these mixes. And our first mix here comes from Mr. Armin. Let's check it out.
The strange light overshadows the trail of hate and cracks the silent dopamine to commemorate. Sacrilegious of insatiable lust has got me thrown on my knees and to the pain of God. I wanted to leave, but can't return the body because my soul won't grieve. Night never ends. His last look within, how will you ascend?
Okay, so Armin, I really like what I'm hearing. I really dig the old school kind of death metal tremolo pick riffage going on. Now, you asked me in your email what I thought about your low end, and dude, I really dig your low end. And I also like how I can kind of hear the bass in a slightly distorted way sitting right behind the guitars where it's not overpowering the guitars, but I can still hear it. I also really dig the drum tone, and it's cool that the guitars have that nice jagged sort of tone to them, but they sound nice and they fit the production well in my opinion. My only note that I hear, at least upon first listen, is that I hear some of that gargly stuff happening on the vocals, which is extremely common with vocals that are in this style. Now, let me just say this. This used to drive me insane when I would mix back in the day. And I always thought it's because I was using cheap mics or cheap interface and I didn't own, high-end preamps. But in reality, all you have to do is take a high shelf filter and just reduce all frequencies above around 8 to 10K. There is no magic number, and the reason why I'm recommending a high shelf and not a low pass filter is because if you were to use a low pass filter and remove all frequencies, like let's say above 10K, it would almost sound like your vocals would have like a film or a cloud sitting on top of them. And we don't want that. We still want the vocals to be nice, crisp, and clear, but without that unnecessary top end that gives it that weird gargly sound that's kind of distracting to listen to, at least within the context of the mix. Because what ends up happening is a lot of that top end will conflict with the top end of your guitars, and especially your cymbals. And I definitely hear that right off the bat when I first listen to your mix. Overall, the mix is sick. I really dig it. Just apply that low shelf filter to your vocals and reduce some of that top end. Thank you for your submission. Okay, and our next mix here comes from Mr. Hendrick. Let's see what we got. Okay, well, Hendrick, your production sounds killer. I can tell you spent a lot of time tracking properly and definitely editing, which is a step in the right direction, and it's something that most people neglect to do, unfortunately. And that automatically gives your mix a nice polished, professional sound right off the bat. Now, you were asking me what I thought of your low end, and to me, your low end is sounding pretty tight, maybe because the music is so tight, but here's a simple thing to remember. If you're having too much of a buildup of low end, remember, all you really have to do, especially if it's just a simple buildup across most instruments, is utilize your low shelf filter. It's pretty much the complete opposite of what I just mentioned on the last mix. If you have a buildup of either top end or low end, your low and high shelf filters are your best friends because you can really manipulate that range while keeping it nice and transparent, and it's not as extreme as a low or high pass filter. Remember, a low and high pass filter will completely reduce any range above or below the specified cutoff points, and a shelf filter doesn't do that. It simply reduces or boosts all frequencies above or below a specific set frequency. So if you feel that you have too much of a low end buildup here, maybe on your drum submix, you could reduce all low end below 100 Hertz. Same thing on your bass submix, maybe your guitars, or maybe on the mix as a whole. But to me, man, I'm digging the low end. The only thing that's standing out to me, and again, this is just my own personal opinion, is that it sounds like your drum bus is heavily clipped. In other words, I'm not feeling much transient from the snare drum. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It definitely gives the mix a certain vibe, but if you feel like you're limiting your mix too much and it's just too compressed, always listen closely to your snare drum. Your snare drum is usually a dead giveaway when this becomes an issue. But again, this is highly subjective. Some people really like the sound of clipped drum buses and mixes. If you feel like your mix is too heavily compressed, processed, and clipped, just back it off a little on your drum bus or the mix as a whole. It's really as simple as that. So Hendrick, awesome production. You're doing killer work, and thank you for your submission. Okay, our next mix here comes from Mr. Mo.
His life twists and turns, counted on many hits, then leaves by the wind, falling, blown around and stripped away. Still he stumbles, trudges on, torn apart by guilt and pain. The path that leads him home, shadowed with cold embrace, betrayals crush his soul.
Okay, well, Mo, I like what I'm hearing. The drums have a nice warm vibe to them. The shouty, yelly style vocals really help match the vibe of the track. Now, you mentioned to me in your email that you're having trouble with your snare getting lost within your mix. And I can tell you right off the bat, a lot of this has to do with the fact that your mix is very, very limited, and it's really pushing, you know, that zero line in my meters. Now, I don't know what limiter you're using for your mastering, but the truth is not all limiters are created equal, at least in the clipping department as far as transparency on your snare drum. So with that being said, regardless of the limiter you're using, you might want to try backing your mix down just a hair, and you'd be amazed at how much clearer and open your mix will end up sounding. Because remember, with streaming services these days, your master does not have to be screaming loud. Now, as far as the limiter you're using, I found that limiters by Isotope and Slate Digital tend to be extremely transparent, and you can get away with a little more limiting without that snare drum getting lost within your mix. So again, I'm not too sure of what you're using, but I do hear what you're saying. The snare drum does get slightly lost when all of that busyness happens. So in my opinion, you have two main options. Back the limiter off just slightly, it won't hurt anything, and again, because of streaming services, your mix doesn't have to be crazy loud, and maybe try a few different limiters and see which produces the most transparent result. And also remember, a little bit of bus compression, a little bit of tape saturation, a little bit of multiband compression after that will help kind of control your mix before limiting even takes effect on your mix as a whole, and that alone will help you create a much more transparent but loud master. So if you're not doing that, I highly recommend taking that stacking approach on your master fader as well. It will definitely serve you well. So Mo, excellent production, and thank you for your submission. Okay, and our next mix here comes from Jonathas.
Fights are love, it's a blind side you play. Something is the right time to make a choice.
Jonathas, I just want to say, if you produce this, amazing job. I don't know if this is something that you produced yourself or something that you just mixed, but yeah, the tracking sounds on point. Everything is so tightly edited. It just sounds super crisp and powerful. There's not much here I would change. The only thing, much like with the last production I just reviewed, is that it's extremely compressed and limited. And in my opinion, it really doesn't have to be that loud and that compressed. As a matter of fact, I feel like your mix would be even more powerful if you left a little bit of wiggle room up at the top there, just so your mix has some room to breathe. But again, this is just my own personal preference. Maybe you like really, really squashed loud masters. If so, stick with what you got, because to me, it already sounds great, but that's the only thing that I would change, at least upon first listen. So dude, if you produced this, amazing work. And even if you didn't and you just mixed it, amazing work nonetheless. All right, and our final mix here comes from Mr. Cameron. Let's check it out. Okay, well, Cameron, I can tell right off the bat that you're definitely not going for, a super duper insanely clean metal mix here. And I completely understand that. And I really dig the, rough punk, sort of like indie aesthetic that's going on. Even if it's not intentional, I dig it. Now, the guitars are not 1000% in sync with one another, but I don't think that's really the point of this production stylistically. So for me, the way the guitars sit and the way the drums sit, that kind of works and it really gels with the vibe of the band. The one thing that is sounding, kind of out of place to me is that the vocals sound overly dynamic. Like they're poking through, then they're a little quiet, then they're poking through, and they're a little quiet. And the thing you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna gain control of your vocals' dynamic range. And the best way to do this is to stack compressors. So on your individual vocal channels, have a compressor working lightly before your EQ, then do your EQing, then have a secondary compressor doing a little more compression. You can compress a little more heavily here or use the same amount as the previous compressor. And then finally, limit your vocal with the brick wall limiter just to catch any stray peaks. In my experience, this is the best way to achieve a nice, consistent vocal sound that doesn't sound compressed and ends up sounding really natural and transparent within any production, regardless of the style of music. The principle here is that each compressor is working very little, and again, it yields a very transparent result that doesn't sound compressed, but is very controlled. And I think that if you implement this within your mix, it'll take your mix to a whole other level. So Cameron, upon first listen, that's the main thing that stuck out to me. And just give some vocal compression stacking a shot, and I think you'll really dig the results. Okay, I would just like to shout out and thank everyone who submitted mixes to my email. And if you're interested in having me review your mix on the channel, there are detailed instructions below in the video's description. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. So you can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And again, be sure to download my polished production checklist for absolutely free. There's a link below to the PDF in this video's description. And until next time, happy mixing.